Hi, this is Shane Morris. Suicide has become an epidemic, and the church has a vital role to play in fighting against it. Our next Lighthouse Voices event on September 5th will help you better understand what that role looks like. Our speaker for this event is Dr. Matthew Sleeth, author of Hope Always: How to Be a Force for Life in a Culture of Suicide. He'll help us understand what's behind the current epidemic and what Christians can do to fight suicide and care for those who are struggling. Tickets are available for both in-person and online attendance. You can register today at colsoncenter.org/lighthousevoices. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Well, it may shock you to hear this, but we live in a time of confusion over sex and gender. A lot of excellent books have been written to help make sense of how we got here and how Christians can undo some of that damage. Here on Upstream, I've talked with authors like Carl Trueman, whose books explain how our conception of the self transformed sex and made it political. We've talked with authors like Abigail Favale, who explains how feminism laid the groundwork for undefining womanhood. We've explored the work of Abigail Schreier, who chronicles the irreversible damage that trans ideology does to children. We've spoken with secular psychologist James Cantor about the scientific and medical fraud currently being foisted on us by the trans movement. And we've spoken with Josh Butler about the deep theological significance of male, female, and God's plan for sex. But that's a lot of books and podcasts. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a one-stop shop where you could get an effective overview of all of these topics and get reoriented in this confusing time, especially on the question that has so lately dogged judicial nominees and documentaries: what is a woman? Well, joining me today is an author who's written that one-stop shop resource. Dr. Katie McCoy is director of women's ministry at Texas Baptists. She holds a PhD in systematic theology from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and served on faculty there for 5 years. She teaches and writes at the intersection of theology, culture, and women's issues, and has co-authored a work on the doctrine of humanity as part of the Theology for the People of God series. Her latest book is called simply To Be a Woman: Confusion Over Female Identity and How Christians Can Respond. And I welcome her to the program today to explore this dense but very readable resource. Dr. Katie McCoy, welcome to Upstream.
Shane, thank you so much for that introduction. I think I just need to copy paste that for everything else that I do. So that was fantastic. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for writing this book. You know, I have to commend you also on the good cover design. I don't know what role you had in picking that, and I know publishers enlist all kinds of creative talent, but the two X chromosomes kind of adorned with, I don't know if it's laurels or some other kind of vine that show the natural character of these things. And it's it alludes to that point that you make in the book so, helpfully, that sex is not a malleable concept and gender is tied inextricably to sex, and it's part of who we are. It's not arbitrary. So good job on that. You're in women's ministry, though, and I have this sense that there's a story behind this book, a very practical story. What inspired you to write it?
Yes, well, I can't take any credit for the cover design. The publishers did excellent with that. But what really inspired the story, or what inspired the book, was kind of an overflow of things that I had taught in the area of women's studies and how it intersected with theology and cultural issues. And about 2 years ago, I joined the team at Texas Baptist and got to take things that I was teaching in the classroom and bring it to the people in the pew, so to speak. Really rubber meets the road, the women, the moms, the ministers who were seeing these issues day to day. And when I was teaching about this in the seminary context, it was very much a fringe issue. It was a couple of outlier stories that were head scratchers, a bit almost sensationalized. But we saw it come more and more to mainstream. It became more centered in essentially social consciousness and people being aware that I don't think this issue is going to go away. And I would hear these stories from people that I serve, different churches. And this is not metroplex churches either. This is rural America. And essentially, wherever there is social media reach, there is the reach of these ideas and the influence of the philosophies that they represent. And so this really was just the overflow of not only the academic, but the ministry, and kind of that opportunity where experience meets need. And it's just been a privilege and a gift to be able to present this to people who are really in that day-to-day challenge of having to deal with the effects of gender ideology.
This book really has the feel of a resource that was hammered out over a long course of answering the same questions again and again interpersonally, and then just eventually deciding, you know what, I'm going to write this down, put in the footnotes, and give people what I'm giving them anyway in a more organized form. It sounds like it was tried in fire, in other words.
Thank you. The funny thing is, I thought, I've got all this research from stuff that I've been teaching. I'll be able to hammer this out quickly. Oh, I had like a pinky finger worth. And I think I had enough to know where to keep researching, because the more you would read, the more there was to find, and the more there was to sort of comb through different ideas. And then, especially the biological chapter. I think that was one of my favorite things to study, because frankly, I studied just a little bit of the neurological differences between male and female. And I thought, for the life of me, I don't know how anybody can be an atheist after they study this. It is astounding, the degree and precision of design and things that science is still just catching up with.
Here's a question I think many people will be asking as they look at the landscape of just the craziness unfolding. This trans issue, which is what kicks off the book and what many of us are thinking about, affects both men and women, right? There are women who want to become men, and there are men who want to become women. Why the focus on women in particular here? Why do you think women have become, and not just in your book, but in the culture as a whole, they've become a focal point of the trans debate, right? The big question with Ketanji Brown Jackson was not, what is a man? It's, what is a woman? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so it's a confluence of different cultural, sociological, and I would even say biological factors. So what we're finding more and more is that this idea is disproportionately affecting teen girls. Now, we certainly see a lot of young boys, teenage boys, and young men being attracted to that. I think that reflects a couple of things: the proliferation of these ideas, and then also the uncomfortable secret is there is a faction of young men who are influenced by certain pornography cultures to adopt a female sense of identity. But among young women, it has exploded. And there are a few reasons for that. One of them being that women are wired for connection and empathy and to harmonize and preserve relationships. That doesn't mean that men are not wired for those things, but that women are, at the neurological, cellular level, particularly inclined for empathy, harmony, and connection. And these differences begin at the 8th week in utero. And so much of what we're seeing is essentially girls being girls and the exploitation of girlhood to confirm for them that this sense of angst, this sense of inner incongruity that they have at puberty actually means some sort of unrealized trans identity. The other factor is social. Girls are, from the time they're little, wired not only for the social, but for the interpersonal communication. And you even hear it in things like, who is whose best friend, right? Like that's something that girls will talk about. You don't really hear little boys talk about that so much. But among girls, this is a big deal. And it's that interpersonal.
The big controversy among little boys is whose dad could beat up whose dad.
Exactly. And this is the difference between boys and girls. You've got boys are inclined towards the competitive. Fascinating statistic I found from, I believe he was a child psychologist, that among little boys, if you would ask a little boy to draw a picture, in all likelihood, he would draw something depicting a conflict and usually some sort of violence, right? It's war. It's this man is rescuing a person from the bad guys, aliens or something. But a little girl of the same age who drew a picture depicting violence, it typically was indicative of a psychological disorder, of something that was wrong psychologically, or it was revealing, it was symptomatic of something else that was also wrong in that little girl's life. And these are just reflecting the neurological differences of testosterone, the endocrinological differences between male and female, even at young ages. So girls, very wired for that connection. When they have a friend, a peer, a teacher who adopts a trans identity, it isn't long before they are adopting that as well. And this is the part of the sociological research that people don't want to talk about in the trans community, certainly not in the media, related to peer contagion or social contagion. It's catching on. It is catching on the same way anorexia might catch on and spread among girls. Bullying, perhaps, would be another example of social contagion. And then the other element, Shane, is social media. We are still catching up with the effects of social media, particularly on young people. I was delighted to see that our Surgeon General has initiated a program to alert parents on the dangers of social media on teen mental health. What he stopped short of, however, is connecting those dangers of teen social media use with the proliferation of trans identity. Of course, that would be a political no-no, because what most people in our culture are wanting you to believe is that people have always been transgender to this degree and percentage of the population. But now it's just a free enough society and accepting enough society that they can acknowledge it. The trouble with that argument, of course, is why are we only seeing this concentrated among one generation, typically Generation Z and some millennials, and then Gen Alpha coming behind Gen Z? By that time, this has been indoctrinated at the level of elementary school curricula. So all of those things, it's like you throw them together in a big soup, put it on simmer, let it sit for several years. And this is essentially what our culture is now serving people who are 30 and under.
One of the foundational, that was very helpful. Thank you. One of the foundational assumptions of this whole gender identity movement has been shared with the gay rights movement, and that is that people are born this way. And you mentioned that a second ago, that this is an innate thing that has always been a feature of the lives of a certain percentage of the population. And now we're just tolerant enough that these folks can come out of the closet and declare their true selves. As I understand it, there are important statistical reasons why this doesn't really line up with reality. And you mentioned one a second ago, the explosion of transgender identity among girls. Why is that not consistent with a born this way narrative?
Yeah, so by the time, there's several factors. Let's start with this. First of all, transgender, what we would call transgender now, that has been around for millennia. And I mentioned this in the book, that there was a particular Roman emperor who wanted to be a woman. And there was a particular cult in the ancient world where the men castrated themselves and dressed in women's clothing as a way to worship a female deity. This concept of trying to disconnect one's biological body from one's sense of being a man or a woman, that is not new. What is new is the social contagion element that we're seeing, particularly affecting girls today. Now, the thing that people talk about with this born this way argument is that there must be some type of brain-based neurological cause for trans identity or gender dysphoria. There are three problems with that. First, endocrinology, the impact of hormones on human behavior, on self-perception, on how we relate to other people. That is something that we cannot separate or dissect away from the human body. You know, much of these conversations, they reflect the unique, complex whole that God created humanity to be. The same way that we can't identify and dissect what is the image of God in someone and what is not. It pervades their entire identity. Maleness or femaleness, manhood or womanhood is the same way. We can't dissect it or just relegate it to one particular system of the human body. So endocrinology is one factor. The second is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a phenomenon, and it's one of the ways that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that our brains can adapt. Our brains can adapt and essentially rewire themselves away from information and towards other information. We can sort of kill off certain circuits in our brains and create new grooves. And the ways that we do that are beliefs and actions. This is, again, where science is catching up to the Bible, where scripture talks about renewing your mind. It's true. We actually can not just renew, but we can rewire our brains away from certain thought patterns and towards others. But at the neurological level, when you do something physically and when you believe something, that has a direct effect on those neural pathways and the patterns by which we create them. So even if we were to identify something neurologically in trans-identifying people, it would be impossible to discern kind of the chicken or the egg which came first, because neuroplasticity means that small fine-tuned changes happen in our human brains that can reflect what we believe about ourselves. So it would be impossible to identify, is it a brain-based cause or is it the result of behavior and beliefs? The third is this, and this is so ironic. So if people are saying that there must be a brain-based neurological cause to gender identity, they have just upended the entire argument behind gender ideology. And here's how. Gender ideology says that, and I'm using that term very broadly, and I define it in my book of how I mean it, but gender ideology says that your biological sex has no bearing on your identity of your gender. Your sex and your gender are completely separate. They do not have to connect or relate to each other. Well, if that's the case, then why do we need a brain-based neurological cause to explain transgender? And could it be that there is still that impulse, that recognition that our self-perception should match physical reality, that the immaterial and the material selves should be in harmony? And I think they kind of tell on themselves with that argument quite a bit.
This is where you get the weird whiplash effect of, on the one hand, denouncing gender stereotypes about girls liking pink and playing with dolls, and then immediately saying, if you're a boy who likes pink and plays with dolls, you must actually be a girl. Or if you're a girl who, likes G.I. Joes and camouflage, then you must actually be a boy. That's the reversion to what progressives normally would consider extremely regressive stereotypes. It tells on the ideology, doesn't it? It betrays something that's incongruous or circular at the very heart of it.
Yes, when you take away biological sex from gender identity and say that it doesn't have any bearing, that there's no intrinsic relationship between the two, the only things that you're left with are personal feelings, emotions, and cultural stereotypes. There was a mother who testified before Congress just a few weeks ago, and I think she was from Texas, and talked about how her biological male son had a trans identity from the time he was young. And the way that she confirmed this was he didn't like playing football. He had more of an affinity towards stereotypical female things. And, let's say, for the sake of argument, that her son was among the fraction of a percent of natal males, biological males, who did have gender dysphoria, genuinely had that psychological condition. The psychological condition has been around for a while. What's different is that the approach to therapy has shifted away, as Carl Trueman noted, away from how do we get the mind in harmony with the body to how do we get the body in harmony with the mind. And that reflects ideas that have been percolating in our culture really for centuries, as he details in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and then Strange New World.
Let's talk about a few of those ideas and assumptions. So in many ways, this book is about assumptions, and it's meant to challenge assumptions. And I actually sense that it would kind of force someone who's been swept up in all of the hype, perhaps even a young person, to stop and re-examine certain things they've taken for granted. In fact, early in the book, you sort of acknowledge that potential reader and say, I know you're going to be really offended by what I'm about to say here. Please keep reading because it's going to be important for you to know this stuff and challenging, and you may be very surprised. What questions do you want to immediately prompt in someone who picks up this book, especially someone who would be vulnerable to a lot of this ideology?
Yeah, first, asking, where do these ideas come from and why have they all of a sudden become so socially accepted? The other kind of starting point would be to a reader, do you believe that God is real, that he reveals himself in the Christian scriptures, and that everything he says about himself is true? Because if that's the case, then the opening words of the Bible reveal a God who created the physical world. Now, to the ancient mind, that alone was monumental, a huge shift from the other worldviews and pagan religions of its day. To pagan religions, especially in the ancient cultures, the physical world was evil. It was the product of war between the gods or some type of sexual relationship among the gods, and it was connected to something that was negative. And in the words of Nancy Pearcey, no self-respecting God would muck his hands up with physical creation. It was lower. It was something to be avoided, and certainly disregarded. Or the emotional self or the mental self was the higher self. So essentially, wisdom or the philosophy, those were the tasks. First of all, they were the tasks of men. Women were not capable of doing philosophy in the Greco-Roman world, and that was the good. That was the good self. So essentially, the physical body didn't matter. Essentially, what we have is an entire worldview with a lot of different terms and technology that is very, very old. It is thousands of years old, and it's just been repackaged and revised and spread in different mediums now that we didn't have some 40, 50 years ago. And the critical question that I hope a reader would ask is why? And then what do you hope to gain from that? Because here's the thing that I hope the book To Be a Woman would help readers do is recognize that what so many gender dysphoric young adults and teens are looking for is something that they are wired and created by God to find: a sense of inner wholeness, peace, purpose, meaning to their life and why they were created, male and female. That is the sphere and the domain of the Christian worldview. Those things are very real, very human, and very good. And like every other of Satan's deceptions, trans identity or trans ideology just might have a grain of truth. And that grain of truth is this: I feel disconnected. I feel out of harmony, and I think I need to be a new person. Isn't that what they're saying? I need to be a new person. And the truth is, you do need to be a new person. We all need to be made a new person. But the key, how we are made new people, is something that no surgeon, no hormone, no shot can give you. It is from the inside out, a spiritual rebirth that gives us not just continuity, but reconciliation with our Creator. And until we have that, we will never have reconciliation within ourselves.
So the young women who are looking to a gender transition, that many young women now, more than ever before in history, are looking to a gender transition to offer that kind of new personhood or salvation-like event. What does their experience look like? I think this would be a valuable part of the discussion here, just to based on your research, based on the stories you've read. I know you cite folks like Helena Kirshner, whose account I remember reading a couple of years ago, and it was just so eye-opening. What does that look like from a girl's perspective, being drawn into this, catching the social contagion, and then let's say going through with real and destructive physical changes? As one young lady who actually not so young anymore, my age, I saw a video from on Twitter last night, just bemoaning what happened to her 7 years ago and just devastated over it, right? Full transition with mastectomy. What does that look like? How does a person get there?
Yes. So there are 3 spheres of gender transition: social, hormonal, and surgical. Let's start with the social. Once someone declares that they have a trans identity, you might see that social transition happen very quickly. It happens in the form of a change in hairstyle, clothes, perhaps preferred pronouns, or a new name. And the name with which they were born when they were given by their parents is considered a dead name. And that dead name, it's kind of an ominous sounding, or ominous, did I mispronounce an ominous sounding word? But it essentially, it's that I am dead to that person. There again, there's that theological, there's kind of the perversion of something that we're wired to find, but in falsehood. So the social transition is what people tend to see overnight. They might announce themselves as transgender. They get all kinds of affirmation or accolades from their peers, and they continue on that path. If she's female, she might get a breast binder or what just typically called a binder, and that is to flatten her developing breasts. That, by the way, also can cause some long-term tissue damage. So as much as people will say the social transition, fully reversible, some things are not. Plus, once a adolescent has been relating to someone according to a different gender, they would have to really reverse course if they were to go back to identifying with the gender that corresponded to their biological sex. Well, essentially, they've been investing in and creating and curating a new identity. So the next step is hormonal transition. And hormonal transition happens in one of two ways. There are puberty blockers and there are cross-sex hormones. Puberty blockers, drugs like Lupron is one of the most well-known. These are drugs that are prescribed off-label, meaning they were not created to treat or achieve that for which doctors are giving them. These drugs were actually created to save. They were made for aggressive forms of hormonal cancer, like breast cancer or prostate cancer, to arrest the production of hormone, so the patient would have a fighting chance of overcoming that cancer. These doctors are prescribing them to adolescent and prepubescent children to arrest the production of their natural hormones, whether testosterone or estrogen. Puberty blockers are hailed as a way to just press pause on puberty. Fully reversible, completely safe. They are neither reversible nor are they safe. Puberty blockers prevent what's called secondary sex characteristics. So among men, that will be things like a lower voice, increased facial hair. Among women, that would be having menses, so her starting her period, or wider hips, the development of breasts. So essentially, it is medically halting puberty, synthetically so, and it is suppressing what the body was designed to do. Puberty blockers, by the way, our own FDA last summer came out saying puberty blockers had been linked to the risk of brain swelling in children. There's also increased risk of stroke, loss of bone density, and it just shows too the political loyalty that so many of these ideologues have, because of course we have our Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, Rachel Levine, I forget his original name, but saying puberty blockers are medically necessary and life-saving. Our own government is not on the same page about this. Let's talk about cross-sex hormones. Cross-sex hormones essentially help create the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite gender. So among females who take testosterone injections, their face shape will change, their voice will lower, they will have increased body hair. They, I believe, will never get their period again. It can cause sexual dysfunction. Essentially, you're flooding the body with a hormone at a level that it was not designed for. Among biological males, taking oral estrogen causes a strong increase in blood clots, among other things. My own doctor, just an internist doctor, said, when we see someone who is transgender come in with chest pains, we now know to immediately think it's likely blood clots. This is that prevalent. It's horrific. And then there's some awful stories of women who have had just some horrific side effects that are absolutely life-threatening. And then finally, let's talk about surgical interventions. So surgical interventions involve two approaches. First, the amputation of healthy reproductive organs, and the construction of artificial organs. So among women, that will be a hysterectomy, a double mastectomy, and then a phalloplasty to create a prosthetic penis, essentially using with hormonal alterations the body parts of a female. Other things with a phalloplasty, a lot of times doctors skin graft from the arm. So you'll see the arm of a trans man, a biological woman, that has been pretty horrifically carved up. And then
Yeah, there was a cover on either Variety or New Yorker about a year and a half ago that actually just kind of photographed this woman who had undergone the mastectomy and the phalloplasty, and then the arm scar, the skin on her arm, the long strip of skin just completely taken off and replaced with gauze or something, and then she's just standing there in a pair of men's briefs, and it was like the most grotesque, sad photo. And
yes,
the weird part about it was, Katie, the person's expression, her expression was like not happy. It wasn't fulfilled. It was hollow and sort of broken. And then in the interview, that's exactly the way she came across, was hollow and broken. Basically, this didn't make me happy. It was. I think the article is titled something like my artificial penis didn't make me happy. It was
yes,
it was very
yes.
revealing.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing that is coming out more and more, and of course we're lacking data because this is so new, but the data that we have is demonstrating that this is not fixing the mental health issues. Chloe Cole she's one of those outspoken detransitioners, described how she said, I needed therapy. I did not need a gender transition. I did not need surgery. I didn't need testosterone. And her anxiety and mental health issues did not go away. In fact, what her medical health professionals told her parents is, you need to support your daughter's gender transition or she's going to be suicidal. That's another thing that is not only held over parents' heads, but itself is becoming a social contagion. Suicide can be a social contagion as well. And it's sort of, you tell these vulnerable girls, if your parents don't give you this, you're going to be suicidal. Well, their parents don't get on board, and all of a sudden she thinks she's suicidal. And what Chloe Cole described is, it was after the gender transition that she became essentially what all these doctors warned her parents that she would. And so we are still seeing the effects of regret. There is a full court press among a lot of gender ideologues to discredit these rates of regret. I think the latest one is something like, they'll say, oh, 0% of people regret their gender transition, but some 1% of people regret a knee replacement. Where's the outrage over knee replacement? And it's just, the logic has just left the building, because the truth is, you would have to ignore an entire community of thousands of people to say that no one regrets their gender transition. Most of this data that says these gender transition methods are helpful and healing mental health issues, you poke at it long enough, you typically find the results have been misrepresented, or the entire experiment was flawed in its research. So essentially, these headlines have been doctored.
I'm talking today with Dr. Katie McCoy, author of To Be a Woman, about the ideas behind our gender-confused culture and how Christians can bring clarity. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Hi, Shane Morris here. Have you noticed the subtle lies that dominate this cultural moment? Lies like, all you need is love, you are the boss of you, or live your truth. Well, these popular slogans convince us that our true north is found in us rather than in God. But the compass that spins back to us will always lead us wandering in circles. In her latest book, Live Your Truth and Other Lies, Elisa Childers provides the Christian response to these cultural lies, an accurate vision of God's reality and His world. For a gift of any amount to the Colson Center in August, we'll send you a copy of Live Your Truth and Other Lies, so you can learn to discern between popular truth claims and biblical truth and help others to do the same. To request your copy, give today at colsoncenter.org/upchildersresource. We're back on Upstream talking with Dr. Katie McCoy about her book, To Be a Woman. Katie, you've just described the whole kind of grotesque and disturbing process of what happens to a person who becomes doggedly convinced that she is, and we're talking about primarily women here, so I'll say that she is the opposite gender and needs to manifest that socially, hormonally, and even perhaps surgically, physically. But I want to back up for a second because you mentioned the threat of suicide and how that's used to often bully and pressure parents into being okay with this among minors. That raises the question for me of how young girls get these ideas. Where are they coming from? Where are they getting their training, their scripts, the sort of, brainworm that gets into your mind and says, this is what will really make you happy? Because I remember several accounts described this just all-consuming doctrine that takes hold of your life and then causes you to go out and threaten other people to get them on board. Where's that come from?
Yeah. So first, we never want to make light or dismiss any threat or verbal inclination of suicide. But what I think most parents are finding is that once their child says that he or she is transgender, suicide is used as sort of this threat hanging over their head. And doctors hear, well, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? And it's essentially holding them hostage to agreeing to things that they otherwise wouldn't, or they just have questions about. What a lot of parents have come to find is that their child's revelation of their trans identity, they find that it sounds like someone that isn't them, that it sounds like they copy pasted from some other source. And they're right to think that because so many of these so-called trans influencers on social media do just that. They coach children on what to say so that they will walk out of the office with a prescription for puberty blockers. They coach children on what to say to their therapist and what to say to their parents. The other thing you'll find is some of this gets absolutely just pernicious. There was one therapist who told teens, fake a suicide attempt. You'll get what you want. They'll give you what you want after that. The data also is not bearing it out, as we mentioned, because what therapists are finding is that this is the only psychological malady for which doctors will respond with anything other than what they would respond to other causes of suicidality. So for instance, with gender confusion, you find therapists and doctors saying, okay, well, let's get you on this medication. Let's schedule a surgery. But every other cause of suicidality, it is we need to get you in therapy and get you on some sort of medication. And for gender dysphoria, those two factors, talk therapy and medication, are just as effective as they are for other causes of suicidal tendencies. And there are therapists sounding the alarm saying this is just a misuse of what we already know about human nature. There was a wonderful therapist who was with Family Research Council a few weeks ago. She was testifying to Congress talking about this and saying that just the professional literature does not support what affirmative care is propagating. And so many of these things are causing therapists to not only do what is against their training, but in many cases, even against their own conscience, to the point where they're saying, I don't think this person is even transgender. I think there's something else going on. In fact, some of the sociological research demonstrates that as well, that there is something else going on.
Well, you mentioned the fact that many of these children presenting with gender dysphoria are actually on the autism spectrum. Not all, but many of them, that there's a high vulnerability in that group.
Very much. And the research is still showing that Simon Baron-Cohen is a psychiatrist or neuropsychiatrist, and he's not a conservative. He's not coming from any kind of value or faith-based perspective with this, but he said that autistic people have what he would call hypermasculine brains. And the way he describes that is that they are wired for systems. They have a lot of black and white. And so the nuance of relationality or emotion doesn't really connect with them. And so many autistic children, male and female, they hear these trans influencers and say, well, this is why I feel so out of place. This is why I feel so awkward. I was just born in the wrong body. Last thing about the suicidality, what I've heard, I heard this, that this was the best explanation. There was a pastor's wife who talked about how there was this couple in their church where the daughter all of a sudden became trans-identifying and an atheist, and it was because she had access to her phone overnight. There was no parameters, no limits put on the smartphone, and access to social media, and she was threatening suicide. And this pastor's wife said, "Well, then essentially check her into a hospital, get her into a psych ward, because suicide should be treated for suicide. Suicidality should be treated as you would treat suicidality. Not, these are two different things." And there are plenty of transgender people who are not necessarily threatening suicide. So one of the things that makes this so different is that the two have been conflated as opposed to treated as different things within the medical community.
So you structure your book around these questions: how, why, where, what, and who. And this structure helps you to cover a lot of ground in a very short page count. What's the idea behind this structure? And just kind of tell us about what you accomplish with it.
Yeah, so I tried to approach it almost like a journalist. And the way that a journalist might try to explain something is just looking at those who, what, where, why, when, and how. And what are these basic building block questions as we're trying to construct our understanding of why there's so much confusion over female identity today. And with that, focusing on the different spheres and how they relate, but recognizing that, okay, we've got the sociological over here that is promulgating affirmative therapy. We've got the relational over here that is telling people how to relate and sort of get buy-in on their new preferred gender identity. We've got the philosophical that is producing a culture in which these ideas are accepted. We've got the biological that we can't change. We might be able to synthetically alter, but we are irreducibly complex in our maleness and femaleness. And I'm not even talking about the reproductive system. We're talking about neurological system, even some of the muscular issues or skeletal differences between male and female. And then finally, theological. And I leave theological to the end intentionally. And a theological answer is essentially who we are, and that our identity is given to us by a creator. It is not something we can create or self-make. It is bestowed upon us by God. I leave the theological to the end for a couple of reasons. I start with what we see. Let's just take stock of what we're seeing in the world and then essentially work backwards to the theological. And by then, hopefully, what it demonstrates is that the theological, you sort of read that and look back on all of these other chapters and it makes sense. It sort of codifies them together in a way that gives a cohesive whole. I end the book with talking about things that you can't afford not to know. And these are some things that are, I'm telling you what, Shane, I could rewrite that chapter today and it would probably be another 20, 30 pages because it seems like every week there's something new. But trying to give, especially for the parents, the pastors who are dealing with this in the day-to-day, seeing it in their families and congregations, and say, here are some things that you need to be aware of that are happening in our world. It just may be underneath the radar.
One of the central ideas that I think runs through the whole thing, and this is common ground between your work and Carl Trueman's work, is that the underpinning of transgender ideology is a sort of blank slate view of the human person that we can trace back to Rousseau, that we're born into the world as a sort of generic person, and we're actually good. We're oriented in a good and wholesome direction, and then society corrupts us with its expectations and its strictures and its constructs and all that sort of thing. And you can begin to see the common ground there, even if Rousseau himself could never have dreamt of where this stuff would go. But with the male and female concept, and particularly what it means to be a woman, that seems especially important to me. And I want to hear a little bit more about that, because you spend a great deal of time making the case that women are not a social construct, right? Women are not something that we dreamt up in the 1950s and said, okay, well, here's how we're going to segregate the workload and the roles between the industrialized workplace and the home. It's like women are going to do this and men are going to do this, and we're going to just pretend like there's some sort of biological basis for the distinction, the difference, right? What do we know now about what a woman is in distinction from what a man is, and how credible is it to say that basically we're all generic human units that are the same hardware and software wise, we just get conditioned in different directions by society?
Yeah, it's a great question. Essentially, I think what we're seeing with trans ideology is second wave feminism has devoured itself. Let me come back to that in a minute. But you mentioned Abigail Favale at the beginning of the show, and she has, I cite her in To Be a Woman, she has, I think, the best definition of maleness and femaleness in that she ties it to the biological potential in reproduction. Now, that doesn't mean that if you don't have children, you are less of a man or a woman. So, for instance, I don't have biological children, yet I'm no less a woman because my biology is structured around the potential to gestate new life. A male's biology is structured around the potential to create new life or donate genetic material. And so when we see it in those terms, it also frees us up from having to necessarily fit into what we might call cultural stereotypes. This is where I have a definition of biblical womanhood that is, in some ways, people are like, I need more detail. And I say, no, you don't. That's the point. It's that true biblical womanhood is we are females created in God's image who are striving to know, love, and obey God in His word in all of our life in relationships. So, in other words, you're female. God made you a woman. And as you are patterning your life according to His word in all of your relationships, so there's marriage, there's church, there's all the things that we would work it out into, then you are going to fulfill what it means to have biblical womanhood. Same with biblical manhood, just shifted to maleness. And that also reflects a very strong faith in the biological, endocrinological, neurological differences between male and female that God created us to have. In other words, we don't have to systematize them into types, cultural stereotypes, or roles. I don't like that word roles. I feel like it doesn't reflect the fullness and the complexity that God created the differences between men and women to have. So I think separating it from those cultural stereotypes. But with that, as you said, woman is considered a social concept today. And we can find these ideas going back to people like Judith Butler, who said all of gender is a performance, that it's just this social script that we follow under pain of rejection if we deviate from it. And that goes back to much of what we saw in second wave feminism. Second wave feminism, 1960s and 70s, coincides with the sexual revolution. It essentially said to women that the problem of your life is that as a woman, you are de facto oppressed. And if you don't feel oppressed, it's either that you don't know it or you're a traitor to your sex and you're siding with all the patriarchy. And the key to liberation from your oppression is to be free from your biological constraints of reproduction. So with that, you saw the advent of the pill, of course, Margaret Sanger's dream come true, that we have a magic pill that can stop pregnancy, the advocacy for abortion on demand. And then you had strains of feminism talking about marriage as a form of slavery, a form of culturally accepted prostitution. And underneath all of this is this idea that the key to true fulfillment and happiness is to be able to separate yourself from your body, that the body should have no bearing on our identity, on how we should live. Well, fast forward 60 years, and the ideas of second wave feminism have essentially boxed out feminism itself to the point that now, if a feminist insists that a biological man can't be a woman, that she is now an oppressor, the tables have turned because there's a new gender minority in town, and they are claiming that they are the socially oppressed ones, that they are the ones that have to be centered in society, and therefore women who are female and believe that they're women, the constructed term cisgender, which is a made up word. Well, they have to be decentered now because they are the ones who would be propagating the oppression of the new gender minority. And so all of this is gender ideology that began in the 1960s and 70s. Really, a little before that with Simone de Beauvoir and the second sex in the 1950s. And we're seeing it worked out to where now, well, if the body does not have any bearing on who I am as a person, well, then why couldn't a biological male be a woman? And then, of course, we're left with all the same things of gender stereotypes and feelings. So all of that, by the way, the transgender identifying teenager, the gender confused teenager is not pulling from second wave feminism in their consciousness. So what you don't need to do to the 13-year-old who's gender confused is sit down and say, well, let me give you a history of second and third wave feminism and then how we ended up where we are today. They're not aware of it, but they are the recipients of it. And we are all the recipients of the culture into which we were born and the ideas that we have been shaped and formed by. But ironically, this culture that tells people embrace your individuality, this is all about you doing you, those 3-word mantras, live your truth, you do you, follow your heart. It is far less individualistic than people may think. They are following a social script that has been prepared for them for the last 60 years.
That sense that you have, and Carl Trueman opens his book with this, but it's so important to understand the sense that you have that people are reading from a script that they haven't actually read, at least not in terms of its original works. Like these people most young people in our culture have never read Simone de Beauvoir. They've never read Judith Butler. They've certainly never read Rousseau back in the Enlightenment, right? That these ideas nevertheless percolate through the culture into our consciousnesses and inform the way we think prior to even thinking. They're the assumptions or presuppositions or things that we just absorb, and then they operate within us and they work within us and do their work, which is why it's so important to challenge them on the level of ideas. I want to press in just for a moment on this what is a woman question, because I see this again and again and again, and it is the manifestation of one of the ideas that we've absorbed, and that is that there are no, to whack philosophical for a second, there are no universals, right? Things aren't real. There are only names that we place on things. And you kind of play with a little bit of this and give a brief introduction to the philosophy behind it. But the idea is that if a woman cannot be said to have any one property consistently, then the category woman is essentially arbitrary. So if a woman is defined as someone who has a uterus, well, I can point to quite a few people who claim the title woman out there who no longer have a uterus because they've had a hysterectomy for whatever reason. Does that then invalidate the category of woman? You see that argument again and again. What would you say in response to that?
So this is, again, where Abigail Favale just opens up so much for us in terms of clarity to that conversation. You're exactly right. People will say, well, find one trait that every woman in all of human history, in all of the different cultures that we've had, that one trait that they all have. And you can't, because at some point there will be someone who is no less a woman and does not fit that trait. And so this is the difference that Favale talks about, actuality versus potentiality. So that actuality is what we would all be looking at as a trait. Women are more collaborative in nature. Women tend to be shorter than people of their own ethnicity. And those things are generally true. And yet you will find
like statistical averages where things cluster, but you can always find data points outside of it.
Precisely. And the same thing with that, with the biological chapter, it's like, we can't just say every female, every male. It's statistical averages, generalities, and overwhelming groups would fit these particular categories. Someone who's all women are shorter. Well, okay, what about WNBA players, right? All women are more collaborative. What about Margaret Thatcher? That woman did not need to collaborate with anybody, right? And so no less, those people are no less women, but potentiality is what answers that for us. And it talks about, first of all, connecting identity to the body. and says that the female, a woman, is someone who has the potential to gestate new life, has the potential for pregnancy. And when we identify that, it solves and answers 1,000 different other questions, because now she doesn't have to live up to some trait. She doesn't have to follow a social script. She is woman. She is a woman by virtue of the fact that she has a body that is structured around the potential to have a pregnancy.
I love the example. If I can interject for a second, I love the example question you give to prove this, because I've seen people object to that. What does it mean organized around the potential to, sit down, Aristotle. What are you talking to us about? But the moment you say, okay, well, we should mourn with Shane because he can't get pregnant. Everyone knows how ridiculous that is, because I am not the kind of person whose body is ordered around pregnancy. There's nothing to mourn. There's nothing wrong with me because I'm a man. But the same cannot be said of a woman who can't get pregnant.
Precisely.
She has good cause for mourning because her body is unable to fulfill part of its potential. That was really illuminating for me. It's like you already know what a woman is innately because you exercise this in the compassion you show to people whose bodies are broken.
Right. Favale makes that point about infertility. It's like we don't call a man infertile because he can't be pregnant, but because of these norms, because of the structure around which male and female are organized, if a woman has some sort of aberration in her body, we would recognize that as this isn't as it should be. Well, that kind of presumes the concept of should, that there is something that should be. So in other words, there is either an ideal or a norm or a perfect example of. And if that's the case, that also presumes order, purpose, and design. And so even the concept of healing disease or healing any type of abnormality, it's presuming that there is a standard, a norm, a design that this particular instance has not reached but should.
So here's a question I think we should probably land the discussion on, because we need some practical application here. Obviously, giving someone your book is going to be very helpful. Reading your book in preparation for situations like this is going to be very helpful. But if one of my listeners were to find themselves in the situation of confronting, counseling, parenting a young woman who says, guess what, mom, dad, I'm transgender, and then starts reciting the script that she's found, what steps do you immediately take? Well, what's the godly, intelligent, well-informed response to that situation?
Yeah, so this is where I feel like in my own book too, I'm going, all right, now I've hit the limit of how I can serve you, because I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not even a mom, but I can tell you what I found from those sources. There's a wonderful story, and it's included in To Be a Woman, of a young lady who was very influenced by her school system out in California, which, by the way, no surprise here, but California and New York are the worst, the worst capital, and in propagating these ideas to children. And what this godly Christian family did, they pulled her out of that school, homeschooled her, and reinforced family relationships. That was a big one. They refused to give in to the desires or demands for any type of social or hormonal transition. And they asked her very critical questions. This is something that parents would assume, that they take their child to a therapist, and that therapist is going to ask questions that are pretty basic, like, why do you feel like this? Or how long have you felt like this? Or did something happen right before that all of a sudden made you feel like this? Like, those are things that therapists are not doing in the name of gender affirming care. And that has a lot of political influence. I would even say a political machine behind it to ensure that. And so these parents described how they helped essentially almost take their daughter out of a cult, was how it seemed to read, and help reconstruct her sense of her identity. The other thing would be seizing that smartphone, because most of this is reaching children because of social media. And so having a very strict, inquisitive view of smartphone, I forget the app, but there's some app that allows parents to see what their kids are clicking on, watching, and like the kids don't know it. This is what I was speaking to this about out in Houston, and the mom stood up and said, "My daughter doesn't know I have this app. So, you don't want to tell your kids," but she was able to know and then to discern and start those conversations from that point of knowledge, not, oh my goodness, for the last 2 months, she's been down this rabbit hole on Reddit and now we're reaping the results of it. So the big thing is reinforcing that identity, those beliefs that are good, right, and true, challenging those that come from culture, recognizing that gender dysphoria, especially sudden gender dysphoria, more than likely it is a symptom. There is something else that is going on. It could be peer influence. Some research is indicating that a lot of times girls, especially who are suddenly transgender, are using it as a coping mechanism to something else. That something else could be something traumatic, or it could be, she's not doing well in school, or she's being bullied, or she had a breakup, and it's just a way to sort of recenter pain in a way that gets positive attention. Doesn't mean that she's acting, it means she's redirecting. And then finally, social media. So looking at these factors, it would be, I can't imagine how difficult it is to raise kids in our world today. But the sooner you have those conversations that say, God created you in love and he made you down to every chromosome on purpose, because this is who you were made to be, down to the 23rd chromosome of whether you would be male or female. And it's all by design, and it's all beautiful and good. And these things that your world is telling you, you will be more fulfilled. Well, let's listen to these other stories of people who did all of that, and they're still not fulfilled. So, it's the same. It's kind of that proverbial, how does someone recognize a counterfeit dollar bill? They don't study all the variations of the counterfeit. They study the original, and they know the original so well that they can identify the counterfeit. I think that's an opportunity that parents and churches have to present what is true, what is good, and what is authentic, so that children, as they grow up in a world that has really lost its mind, that they can identify what is counterfeit.
Excellent. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Katie McCoy, author of To Be a Woman. Katie, thank you so much for doing this vital and practical work, and for joining me today on Upstream.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.